The Vorthak hegemony controlled everything. For 3,000 long years, their giant warships had swept across the galaxy like a plague, crushing anyone who dared to resist. Their ships were massive, some as big as entire cities floating through space. When these metal monsters appeared in your star system, you had two choices: surrender or die. Admiral Kravthul had seen it happen countless times. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, watching the stars through the massive viewing window. This ship alone could destroy entire planets. Behind him, hundreds of alien officers worked at their stations, all from different species that had been conquered long ago. They wore the grey uniforms of the hegemony now, serving their masters without question. The galaxy map in front of him showed the truth in glowing red dots. 847 star systems under hegemony control. Every single one had fallen the same way. First came the scouts, then the demands for surrender, then the overwhelming force that made resistance pointless. It had worked for 3 millennia without fail, but today something was different. Lieutenant Vextar, a reptilian creature from the Zephan system, approached with a data pad. His scaled hands trembled slightly as he handed over the report. Even after 50 years of service, the younger officers still feared their commanders. "Admiral, we have a situation in Sector 7749, Vextar said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kravthul took the pad and read silently. His 4 eyes widened as he processed the information. 3 scout ships, gone. Not captured, not damaged, completely destroyed. The system in question was unremarkable, containing only one habitable world orbiting, a yellow star. The inhabitants called themselves humans. "Impossible," Kravthul muttered. "Our scouts have adaptive shields and quantum armor. Nothing in that primitive system should be able to harm them." But the evidence was clear. The 3 ships had sent their final transmissions from the edge of the system before going silent. No distress calls, no battle reports, just empty space where proud hegemony vessels once flew. Other officers began gathering around, their various alien faces showing the same expression of disbelief. In 3,000 years, no single system had ever destroyed even one scout ship on first contact. Most species barely had weapons that could reach orbit, let alone threaten hegemony technology. "Sir," another officer spoke up, "this was Commander Thekmol, an insectoid creature whose species had been conquered 800 years ago. Perhaps it was a technical malfunction? Solar flares or gravitational anomalies?" Kravthul studied the data again. The humans had been broadcasting radio signals into space for barely 2 centuries. Practically yesterday in galactic terms, their technology readings showed they had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. By every measure, they should have been cowering in fear at the sight of hegemony scouts, yet 3 ships were gone. The Admiral walked to the strategic planning table, where a hologram of the galaxy slowly rotated. Red zones showed hegemony control, while tiny yellow dots marked systems still being evaluated for conquest. The Sol system was one of these dots, unremarkable except for its recent aggressive behavior. "How many ships do we typically send for first contact?" Kravthul asked. 50 vessels, sir," came the immediate reply. "Standard doctrine calls for overwhelming force to prevent unnecessary casualties." Kravthul nodded slowly. 50 ships could glass an entire planet in minutes. But something about this situation felt different. Call it instinct, or perhaps the wisdom that came from commanding fleets for over 2 centuries. But he sensed these humans were not like other species they had encountered. "Double it," he commanded. "Send the 17th Fleet. 200 ships." The bridge fell silent. 200 warships had never been needed for a single system conquest. That kind of force was reserved for rebellions involving multiple star systems or species with advanced military technology. "Sir," Vextar ventured carefully, "are you certain? Our intelligence suggests they barely have a dozen ships total." "Our intelligence also suggested they couldn't destroy our scouts," Kravthul replied coldly. "I will not underestimate an unknown enemy." Within hours, the largest hegemony battle fleet assembled in decades began moving toward human space. Massive dreadnoughts, sleek destroyers, and countless support vessels formed a formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Each ship carried enough firepower to reduce mountains to dust. As the fleet entered hyperspace, Admiral Kravthul remained on his bridge staring at the tactical display. Something deep in his mind whispered warnings, but he pushed them aside. The hegemony had never failed. They would not start now. Behind him, officers returned to their duties, confident in their technological superiority. None of them suspected. They were about to encounter something the galaxy had never seen before. Humans who refused to surrender. The journey to Sol would take 3 days. 3 days before the hegemony learned that some prey had evolved into predators. The moment the hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, every sensor on every ship should have been screaming warnings. Instead, they found something that made no sense at all. Complete silence. Admiral Kravthul stood on his bridge watching the tactical display with growing confusion. Where were the desperate evacuation ships? Where were the panicked transmissions begging for mercy? Every other species in galactic history had reacted the same way when faced with hegemony power. Absolute terror, followed by immediate surrender. But the humans were different. A single ship sat waiting for them in the darkness between planets. Just one vessel, roughly the size of a hegemony destroyer, but built with strange angular lines that their computers couldn't fully analyze. It hung motionless in space like a predator waiting for prey to come closer. "Sir," reported the sensor. "Officer, we're detecting one human vessel. Designation appears to be UES Defiant. It's not moving." Kravthul studied the ship through the main viewer. It looked different from anything in their databases. Where hegemony ships were smooth and curved, this human vessel had sharp edges and what looked like armor plating covering every surface. Weapon ports dotted its hull like the eyes of some metal beast. "Open a communication channel," he ordered. The main screen flickered, and suddenly they were looking at a human. "Captain." Li Hun appeared to be middle-aged by his species standards, with dark hair and calm eyes that showed no fear whatsoever. Behind him, his bridge crew worked at their stations with quiet efficiency. "I am Admiral Kravthul of the Vorthak Hegemony," the alien commander announced in his most intimidating voice. "You are surrounded by 200 warships. Surrender immediately and your deaths will be merciful." Li Hun looked directly into the camera. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "This is Captain Li Hun of the United Earth ship Defiant. You have entered human space without permission. You will withdraw immediately or face the consequences." The bridge of the Eternal Dominion erupted in surprised chatter. Had this human actually just threatened them? Admiral Kravthul felt his 4 eyes narrow in disbelief. In 3,000 years, no single ship had ever made demands of a hegemony fleet. "You dare threaten us?" Kravthul's voice rose in anger. "We have conquered 847 star systems. We have crushed civilizations older than your entire species. Surrender, now or we will turn your pathetic ship into cosmic dust." Captain Lee's expression didn't change. "Then I guess we'll have to do this the hard way." The communication cut off. For a moment, nobody on either side moved. Then Li Hun's voice came over the tactical comm to his crew. "All stations battle ready. Target their lead ships. Fire when ready." What happened next changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare. The Defiant opened fire with weapons the hegemony had never seen before. Railguns launched projectiles at incredible speeds, chunks of metal moving so fast they punched through energy shields like they weren't even there. The first 3 hegemony destroyers simply exploded, their hulls torn apart by kinetic force that their defenses couldn't stop. "Impossible!" Kravthul shouted. "Our shields can deflect energy weapons from entire fleets." But these weren't energy, weapons. The humans had taken the simplest concept in the universe, throwing rocks really, really hard, and turned it into something terrifying. Each railgun slug hit with the force of a small nuclear bomb, and the Defiant had dozens of these. Weapons. The human ship began moving in ways that defied everything the hegemony knew about space combat. Instead of the predictable patterns their computers expected, it twisted and rolled through space like a dancer, always one step ahead of their targeting systems. Lieutenant Commander Park Min, the Defiant's tactical officer, watched her screens with fierce concentration. "Captain, they're trying to surround us. Recommend evasive pattern Delta." "Execute," Lee replied calmly, as if he was ordering coffee instead of fighting for humanity's survival. The Defiant spun away from a barrage of plasma bolts, its engines leaving bright trails in the darkness. As it moved, it continued firing those devastating railguns. Each shot found its target, and each target died in brilliant explosions that lit up the void. Admiral Krav-Thul watched in growing horror as his formation began to crumble. The humans were using tactics he'd never encountered, electronic warfare that blinded his senses, unpredictable movement patterns that made targeting impossible, and weapons that simply ignored their most advanced defenses. "How many ships have we lost?" he demanded. 17 destroyed, 12 heavily damaged, came the shaken reply. "Sir, they're not fighting like any species we've encountered. They're not trying to escape or hide. They're actively hunting us." The truth was even more terrifying than that. The humans weren't just fighting, they were winning. One ship against 200, and somehow the math didn't matter. Every move the Defiant made seemed calculated to cause maximum damage while taking minimum risk. But numbers eventually tell. The human ship, no matter how cleverly it fought, began taking hits. Hull breaches appeared along its sides, and its perfect dancing began to slow as systems failed. Yet Captain Li Hu never asked for mercy, never tried to run. His ship fought on with a determination that chilled every alien who witnessed it. The battle had been raging for 3 hours, and Commander Park Min could barely believe what she was seeing on her tactical display. Half the hegemony fleet was either destroyed or drifting helplessly in space, their hulls torn open like tin cans. The other half was starting to show something the galaxy hadn't seen in 3,000 years: fear. "Captain," she called out over the noise of alarms and damage reports, "we've taken multiple hits to sections 4 through 7, hull breaches on decks 3 and 5, but we're still in the fight." Li Hu nodded grimly as he watched the massive alien ships trying to reform their attack patterns. The Defiant was scarred and bleeding atmosphere from dozens of wounds, but her weapons were still firing, and her crew still believed they could win this impossible fight. What the aliens didn't understand was that humans had been preparing for this moment their entire history. Every war, every battle, every conflict had taught them something new about survival. They had learned to turn disadvantages into advantages, to make the enemy's strength work against them. Lieutenant Kim So-ra, the ship's chief engineer, was working miracles in the engine room. Plasma conduits that should have exploded hours ago were held together with emergency patches and sheer determination. The reactor was running at 110% capacity, far beyond safe limits, but it kept the ship moving and fighting. "Engineering to bridge," her voice crackled through the comm system. "I can give you full power for maybe another hour, but after that we're running on borrowed time." "Understood," Lee replied. "Make it count." On the alien flagship, Admiral Krav-Thul was experiencing something he had never felt before in his long military career: doubt. His tactical officers were reporting impossible numbers. One human ship had destroyed or disabled over 90 vessels from his fleet. The mathematics simply didn't work. "Sir," his sensor operator called out, "the human vessel is changing course." Again. It's coming straight for us." Krav-Thul watched in disbelief as the damaged human ship accelerated toward his massive dreadnought. The Defiant looked like a wounded animal, trailing sparks and venting gas, but it still moved with deadly purpose. "All weapons, concentrate fire on that ship," he ordered desperately. Hundreds of energy beams reached out across space, turning the void around the Defiant into a light show of destruction. But somehow, impossibly, the human ship kept coming. Its electronic warfare systems were creating false targets and jamming their sensors. When their weapons did hit, the strange angular armor seemed to deflect or absorb damage in ways their computers couldn't predict. Inside the Defiant, the crew worked with the smooth efficiency of people who had trained for this moment their entire lives. Damage control teams rushed to seal hull breaches, while weapons officers kept the railguns firing with mechanical precision. Nobody panicked, nobody asked to surrender, and nobody suggested retreat. "Target their main sensor array," Captain Lee ordered as another section of his ship's hull was torn away by alien fire. "If we can blind them, we can pick them apart." The Defiant's guns swiveled and fired. The tungsten slugs, traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, punched through the hegemony flagship's defenses and destroyed its primary sensor dome in a shower of sparks and debris. Suddenly, half the alien fleet was operating blind, relying on secondary sensors that the humans were systematically jamming. Ships began firing at their own shadows, confused by the electronic ghosts the Defiant was projecting across their instruments. But the human ship was dying. Atmosphere streamed from dozens of breaches, and entire sections were without power. The bridge itself had taken damage, with sparks flying from overloaded circuits and emergency lighting, casting everything in an eerie red glow. "Sir," Parkmin reported, blood running down her face from a cut above her eye, "structural integrity is down to 40%. We can't take many more hits." Li Hun looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. These were people from all over Earth. Engineers from Seoul, pilots from Busan, weapons specialists from Incheon. They had volunteered for this mission knowing they might never see home again, but not one of them showed regret. "How many enemy ships are still operational?" he asked. "About 60, sir, but they're scattered and confused. Their formation is completely broken." Lee smiled grimly. "Then we've done our job. Signal Earth Command. Tell them the hegemony bleeds just like everyone else." As if summoned by his words, the communication officer's station lit up with an incoming transmission from Earth. The message was short, but it changed everything. "Defiant, this is Admiral Yoon Tae-jin aboard the UES Liberation. We're 3 minutes out with the Second Fleet. 36 ships coming to back you up. Hold your position." For the first time in hours, Captain Lee allowed himself a small smile. The hegemony had come expecting to crush one primitive world. Instead, they were about to learn that humanity had been building a fleet designed specifically to fight superior enemies. The real battle was just beginning, and the aliens were about to discover that the Defiant wasn't humanity's only surprise. The moment Admiral Yoon Tae-jin's fleet dropped out of hyperspace, everything changed. 36 human warships materialized around the battlefield, like ghosts becoming solid. Their weapons already charging and targeting systems locked onto the scattered hegemony vessels. Engineering Officer Kim So-ra felt her heart leap as she watched the new arrivals on her damaged display screen. The UES Liberation led the formation, followed by destroyers, cruisers, and support ships that looked nothing like the traditional designs the galaxy was used to. These were ships built by a species that had learned warfare through necessity, not conquest. "This is Admiral Yoon to all human vessels," came the voice over the comm. "Form up on the Defiant. Let's show these aliens what happens when you threaten Earth." But Captain Lee Hoon was studying his instruments with growing concern. The reactor readings were climbing into dangerous territory, and structural damage was affecting every system on the ship. They had maybe minutes before catastrophic failure. "Kim, what's our status?" he asked quietly. The engineer's voice was steady despite the chaos around her. "Captain, the reactor containment is failing. We're looking at a complete meltdown in maybe 10 minutes. The magnetic bottles are degrading faster than we can repair them." Lee nodded, grimly. He had known this moment would come from the second they decided to make their stand. The Defiant had been built for this kind of sacrifice, to buy time and show the galaxy that humans would not go quietly into extinction. On the hegemony, flagship, Admiral Kravthul was experiencing something he had never felt in his 3 centuries of life: genuine terror. His massive fleet, the pride of the hegemony military, had been reduced to smoking wreckage by creatures he had dismissed as primitives. "Sir," his tactical officer reported with a shaking voice, "we have lost 140 ships. The remaining vessels are requesting permission to withdraw." Kravthul stared at the tactical display in disbelief. The human reinforcements were moving with the same terrifying coordination as the Defiant, their weapon systems tearing through hegemony shields like they were made of paper. But it was more than just their technology. It was the way they fought. These humans didn't fight like any species the hegemony had ever encountered. They didn't seek to minimize casualties or preserve their ships. They fought like beings who had faced extinction so many times that death held no terror for them anymore. "We cannot withdraw," Kravthul said finally. "If word of this defeat reaches the High Council, they will execute us all for cowardice. We fight until the end." But even as he gave the order, he knew it was hopeless. The human fleet was systematically dismantling his forces with tactics that seemed to come from some nightmare version of warfare. They used their own damaged ships as weapons, ramming them into hegemony vessels in coordinated strikes that maximized destruction. Aboard the Defiant, Captain Lee was making his final preparations. The ship's AI had calculated their remaining options, and there was really only one choice that made sense. "All hands, this is the captain," he announced over the ship-wide comm. "We've done what we came here to do. We've shown the galaxy that humanity will not bow to tyrants. Now we're going to make sure they never forget this lesson." Lieutenant Commander Park Min understood immediately. She had served with Lee for 5 years, and she knew that look in his eyes. "Sir, if we overload the reactor while ramming their flagship, the explosion will cripple their command structure and take out at least 20 more ships," Lee finished. "It's the tactical choice that saves the most human lives." The crew of the Defiant accepted their fate with the same calm determination they had shown throughout the battle. They were not suicidal. They were practical. Their sacrifice would ensure that the other human ships could finish the job with minimal casualties. "Set course for the Eternal Dominion," Lee ordered. "All power to forward shields and engines. Kim, I need you to prepare a controlled reactor overload. Maximum yield." The dying ship turned toward the massive hegemony flagship like a wounded predator making one final attack. Its railguns continued firing, even as plasma vents erupted across its hull, and entire sections lost power. Admiral Kravthul watched in horror as the human ship accelerated directly toward his vessel. "All weapons, stop that ship! Everything we have!" The space around the Defiant became a storm of energy as hundreds of weapons concentrated their fire on the approaching vessel. But it was too late. The human ship had become a guided missile, with a nuclear warhead, and nothing could stop its final approach. Kim Sora's voice came over the comm one last time. "Reactor overload in 30 seconds, Captain. It's been an honor serving with you." "The honor was mine," Lee replied as the Eternal Dominion grew larger on his screen. The impact was spectacular. The Defiant struck the flagship's bridge section at full speed, just as its reactor went critical. The controlled fusion explosion that followed lit up half the solar system and sent shockwaves that disabled dozens of nearby hegemony ships. In the aftermath, as the human fleet moved in to finish off the survivors, a single transmission was broadcast on all frequencies, a message that would change the galaxy forever. "This is Earth Command to all hegemony forces. The Defiant was just one ship. We have thousands more, and we're coming for every world you've enslaved." The news spread across the galaxy faster than anyone thought possible. Within 72 hours, every species in every star system had heard the impossible story. The mighty Vorthak hegemony, rulers of 847 worlds for 3,000 years, had been utterly destroyed by a species that most beings had never even heard of. Admiral Kravthul, one of only 12 survivors from the original fleet of 200 ships, found himself in the most humiliating position imaginable. Stripped of rank and branded a coward by the High Council, he was now a living reminder of the hegemony's first major defeat. But worse than the shame was the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The humans weren't finished. They were just getting started. On the slave world of Carrion, a mining colony where the original inhabitants had been working in underground tunnels for 8 centuries, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in living memory, the workers stopped digging. They gathered in the main cavern and listened to smuggled radio transmissions from the outer rim. "The humans destroyed an entire hegemony fleet," whispered Veltar, an elderly Carrion whose grandfather had seen the original conquest. "One ship held off 200 until reinforcements arrived." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Everyone knew the stories were just wishful thinking. Nothing could stand against hegemony technology. But then came the recordings. Actual battle footage captured by long-range sensors showing human ships tearing through the pride of the alien navy like sharks through a school of fish. For the first time in centuries, the word hope was spoken aloud in the tunnels of Carrion. Meanwhile, in the fortress system of Vorthak Prime, the High Council was in emergency session. The massive pyramid structure that housed their government had not seen this level of panic since the early days of their expansion. Ancient beings who had lived for millennia suddenly looked fragile and uncertain. "How is this possible?" demanded High Counselor Tekvarun, his multiple arms gesturing frantically at the holographic displays. Our technology is superior to anything in the galaxy. Our ships are invincible. But the evidence was undeniable. Captain Yun Tai-jin of the UES Liberation had followed up the Sol victory with devastating attacks on 3 more hegemony strongholds. His ships moved through space like ghosts, appearing without warning to destroy supply convoys and communication stations before vanishing back into the void. The humans weren't trying to hold territory. They were dismantling the entire infrastructure that held the hegemony together. Every attack was precisely calculated to cause maximum disruption with minimum risk to human forces. Commander Choi Min-ho had taken a different approach. His squadron of fast attack ships was liberating slave worlds one by one, teaching the inhabitants to fight back against their oppressors. On Zerion Beta, the uprising had started with just 12 human advisors. Within a week, the entire planet was in revolt. What terrified the hegemony leadership most was how quickly the rebellion was spreading. Species that had been docile for centuries were suddenly remembering what freedom felt like. Weapons caches, hidden for generations, were being uncovered. Ancient resistance networks were coming back to life. The humans had done something no conqueror in galactic history had ever accomplished. They had given an entire galaxy permission to hope. On Earth itself, the mood was grimly determined. Admiral Park Jun-seo stood in the command center beneath Seoul, watching tactical displays that showed human fleets moving throughout hegemony space. Each dot represented hundreds of lives, men and women who had volunteered for missions they might not survive. "Status report," he requested from his aide. "Sir, Operation Liberation is proceeding ahead of schedule. We've freed 17 systems in the past month. Enemy resistance is lighter than expected. Most of their fleets are in full retreat." Park nodded grimly. The humans had learned something important from that first battle at Seoul. The hegemony wasn't invincible. They were just bullies who had never faced real opposition. When confronted with an enemy that refused to surrender, they crumbled surprisingly quickly. But the real victory wasn't military. It was psychological. Lieutenant Lee Minji, monitoring communications from across the galaxy, was hearing something that no hegemony citizen had heard in 3 millennia. Laughter. Not the bitter laughter of the defeated, but the genuine joy of beings who suddenly believed they might live to see freedom. The propaganda networks that had kept billions of slaves obedient were failing. Stories of human victories were spreading faster than the censors could suppress them. Every world liberated by human forces became a beacon of hope for 10 others. Former Admiral Kravthul, now living in exile on a backwater moon, received a visitor he hadn't expected. Captain Kim Do-hyun of the Human Diplomatic Corps sat across from him in a simple cafe, looking nothing like the terrifying warriors who had destroyed his fleet. "Why?" Kravthul asked simply. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from the galaxy?" Kim's answer was so simple that it took the alien several minutes to fully understand it. "We want you to leave everyone alone," she said. "We want every being in the galaxy to have the same choice we had, the right to say no." As human fleets continued their liberation campaign across the galaxy, one truth became clear to everyone. The age of the hegemony was over. The age of human liberation had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again.